So this week's lecture will be looking at the powers and the functions of local government. By the end of it, you should have a good awareness of the different powers allotted to each tier of local government in the UK. You should be aware of the variety of those powers across different levels and across different parts of the UK, and the histories, reasons and justifications for those differences. And also the role of things like combined authorities and parish councils, and also to be aware that these are underpinned by different types of, different pieces of legislation. So they don't all come from the same source, they're varied. Also on the graph or the chart, you can see a brief distribution of powers from the Institute for Government. And this is a really useful way of visualising it. So you can see that not all types of authority have the same type of powers, especially the difference I think is most stark when you compare unitary authorities with unitary authorities in Northern Ireland, but also comparing things like London boroughs, which, you know, on the face of it look like unitary authorities, look like 32 unitary authorities in London, but actually there are a few areas, for example, the obvious one there is coastal protection, that London boroughs don't have. That would be, I assume, part of the Greater London Assembly. So not all local governments have the same powers. Okay, so let's talk about the issue of governing versus governance. So this is a recurring theme throughout the module. To what extent have reforms or developments reinforced the idea of local governance rather than local government? And is this necessarily a bad thing? So first of all, what is the difference, right? Local government is councils of elected politicians who make policy decisions on behalf of local communities. The typical model we think of when we think of the role of local government. You might think of, say, MPs as well, making policy on behalf of the country. Now, this differs from local governance, which is a different way of understanding how power is used and where it's located on a local level. So this, local governance is an organisational framework which sees policy as an outcome of processes that are no longer fully controlled by the government, the local government in this case, but rather subject to negotiations between a wide range of public, semi-public and private actors whose interactions give rise to a relatively stable pattern of policy making that constitutes a specific form of regulation or a mode of coordination. So essentially, where in local government you have one individual who just decides policy, that is the local government. In local governance, the local council is just one player within a wider policy creating framework, and the policy itself does not necessarily reflect what the local government wanted. And you can think of this, a good analogy I think is ordering a pizza, right? In the local government module, the one person will decide for a group what pizza they have. We'll have pepperoni, right? Or even think of it as ordering a takeaway. The government model would be you choose somebody to decide what pizza to have, to decide what food to have. We're going to have a pizza, we're going to have a pepperoni pizza. Whereas in local governance, you include everybody in that discussion. And it might be that you've got some people who have already eaten, so they won't have as much of an influence over the people who are really hungry. It might be that one person is paying or is paying more, and so they have a greater say. People have different levels of influence over what you eventually order, but you all feed in and not one individual has power. So the table on the slide is taken from Wilson and Game and shows some of the key differences or tensions between government and governance. Now, it's important to note that the governance network idea doesn't mean all bodies are equal participants, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Asymmetric power, resources, things like that all make a difference, and local government still remains often the only elected body in the policy-making network. Or if there's, a role for central government, well, it's the one that's elected closest to the people. And so that gives local government a priority role in local governance networks, but they are not the only actor, and they are not completely unconstrained in what they can do. In 2004, Stoker wrote that established ways of doing local government are giving way to new governance alternatives. But again, with this recognition that local government is unique in being directly elected and therefore directly electorally accountable. This, however, raises a second issue, one of democratic accountability. If local government is just one actor in local governance, but it is the only actor accountable to the electorate or directly accountable to the electorate, how do we know that councillors or local representatives are being rewarded or punished for decisions that they themselves have actually made? So Leach argues that at one time we elected local councils to provide a wide range of services and functions and had the opportunity to hold them to account if they performed unsatisfactorily. Now we elect them to network and negotiate with partners to do things for which they would previously have had exclusive responsibility. Is it a problem that most members of the public have no idea about this and look at things like urban development, schools, parks, social care, healthcare, and assume that the council have a role in it or are the sole providers, instead of rather a complex network of bodies with competing chains of responsibility or accountability? For example, home care is overseen by local authorities but is often contracted out to companies because of things like, legislative expectations. So if a council is forced to choose an outside company rather than providing a service itself, how accountable should the council be if something goes wrong with that quality of care? These are questions that arise in the governance network model that aren't necessarily as present in the local government concept. So this is part of a broader direction of local government over the last few decades, which Wilson and Game argue makes the role of local government to be about commissioning rather than the direct provision of services. So as such, it might not actually be useful to talk about the powers of local government, but rather the functions of local government, and hence why this lecture is called Powers and Functions, because there is a difference between what a local government is empowered to do directly and what it is reliant on outside actors, or what it is empowered to do and what it is empowered to find somebody to provide. And so for Wilson and Game, the role of local authorities is less delivery, more steering, right? Less delivering the goods, less sailing the ship, and more trying to steer, right? The idea of local governance was pushed hard under the Thatcher and Major governments, with the rise of quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, which were often set up to take care of single functions. The idea was continued under the New Labour government. The 1999 White Paper, Modernising Government, put the idea of joined up or integrated government at the centre, and expected this from local government as well. The New Deal for Communities and Sure Start, for example, were designed to bring together a range of previously fragmented agencies and services, creating joined-up government to meet community needs more effectively. And so this meant that, once again, policy output isn't just reliant on an individual actor. For example, you might have, say, the local council providing childcare places, nursery places in a local area. Now, the quality of a child's education isn't just dependent on what they get in, say, in nurseries, right? It's also dependent on kind of other factors such as, can they go out and exercise and get enough fresh air? Are they eating healthy, nutritious food? And so you'd have all these different organisations that had different responsibilities. In local government, they would just be stuck to one silo, the delivering of their core services. In local governance, they'd be part of a network that would cover all different aspects of policy delivery and related services. Robert Hill, an advisor to Blair, saw an upside in this, kind of which you'd expect from being an architect of this type of system. But, it's not all doom and gloom in the idea of local government having fewer and fewer powers. Robert Hill said, councils themselves deliver fewer services than previously, but their sphere of influence has increased. They've acquired duties and powers that enable them to steer events and developments in their area, or to place shape. Now, this isn't to be sneered at. The Local Government Association found that in 2009, local councils undertook, on their own or in partnership, over 800 different functions. And in 2010, they spent £173 billion, 1/4 of total government spending, and 12% of the UK's GDP. So they are big players, and these the things that they can do within these local governance networks isn't to be, brushed off. So the first thing to say is this table is relatively old compared to the one I showed on the learning objective slide, but I think this breaks it down in a slightly different way compared to the other one. So it's just to be aware of the different the things get out of date easily in the study of local government. Okay. So the first thing to take into account with the table is that it doesn't include metro mayors or combined authorities, but these bodies have little direct powers in and of themselves, and more so their power is strategic to ensure the councils within the combined authority are working in a common direction. And like I said in last week's lecture, where I provided a link to the powers that each combined authority does have, they differ. Okay, so just be careful of that as well. Just be careful of everything, right? That's my advice. However, the table is still a good indicator of the divide between different sections of local government. Now, for Wilson and Game, generally speaking, the fundamental distinction between local government and either the private sector or central government is that the private sector is mainly about products, local government is more about services, and central government mainly about policy. Now, you might think that has changed since Wilson and Game wrote this in 2011. But they point to the fact that there are only 500,000 central government civil servants compared to 3 million local government employees. And that's because the UK central government is not, on the whole, a large-scale provider of services. So, for example, Kent County Council's 1.4 million population makes it larger than a quarter of states in the United Nations, and its £2.3 billion revenue budget in 2009 to 10 was higher than a fifth of nations within the UN at that time. So local councils can be big business. However, despite covering a larger region / population than most other European countries, local government in the UK covers a smaller range of services than European countries. For example, hospitals and health services are covered by the NHS in the UK, which is a legally separate institutions, and the provision of welfare is covered by central government. Education services are usually provided directly by local government in Europe. Local authorities provide and maintain school premises, but the national government employs the teachers. In the USA and Canada, many schools are run by elected special authorities or boards. And when it comes to public utilities as well, Britain is one of the exceptions. Is also the exception rather. In almost all other European countries, municipalities still provide one or more of the utilities: water, electricity, gas. That were mainly the local government services in Britain until their nationalisation in the 1940s and privatisation in the 1980s. This is changing, however. So in 2011, councillors in Nottingham were trying to tackle fuel poverty in the city. Officers suggested a price comparison website, but the Labour government instead set up its own gas and electricity company, Robin Hood Energy. Liverpool City Council also tried this method with Lecky. Now, interestingly, at the time this was seen as very innovative, but in 2010 the BBC ran an article, Robin Hood Energy, the failed council firm that cost the city millions. And so what you see is actually, without that institutional background, councils find it hard to find the expertise to compete, or if they're trying to do public good, they find it hard to compete with the private sector in these areas. And we see a lot of praise for this model, but put that within the context of the very cutthroat margins through price comparison websites and things like that. It can be very difficult to bring back those powers or to compete. So overall, you might think that this table of local authority responsibilities is quite big. You don't have to memorize it, obviously, it's quite big, but compared to other European countries and their forms of local government, it is not that big. So a brief run through of the type of services that local councils provide will show that councils are still large-scale service providers, despite severe economic pressures and increasing collaboration with partners. But, as will be seen, they are, in Davis's words, no longer the undisputed leaders of communities. They will find themselves sharing the local turf with a whole range of bodies, whilst also exercising governmental powers at the local level. Wilson and Game argue there are 4 types of local services that local government provides, shown in the table, or in the image at least. Firstly, needs services, and needs services are for everyone, regardless of means. Education. So we've seen the erosion of local authorities' role in providing education since the 1980s, towards one where local authorities become commissioners. Nowadays, it's probably more accurate to say the school education has become a national function, especially with the rollout of academies and things like that, where control is taken away from local authorities and standards are largely set by central government, alongside things like the national curriculum. There's the 1988 Education Reform Act, which introduced the National Curricula Standard Attainment Tests, or SATs, and forced local education authorities to give 85% of their education budgets to school governing bodies, who became responsible for the running of schools. It also enabled schools to opt out of the control of their local education authority and be funded instead as grant-maintained schools, directly by central government, which then recharged the cost to the LEA if approved by a parental ballot. This trend continued under Labour with the Education and Inspections Act 2006, which made it easier to move schools out of the control of local education authorities. And it said that all new schools, and eventually LEA-run community schools, should be publicly funded and independent from LEAs. Wilson and Game argue that the strategy was clear: to make secondary schools in particular more appealing to and controllable by middle-class parents, so their children would stay part of the 93% in the state school system, and they themselves would support the government's public investment programmes rather than demand tax cuts for education they don't use. Coalition government continued to swiftly and substantially increase academies, which were outside of local government control, and all of this, as a result, LEAs or local authorities have moved from a role whereby they provide to a role where they fill a strategic commissioning role, where they identify children's needs and parents' preferences and champion their interests in finding new and appropriately diverse providers, excluding, apart from exceptional circumstances, themselves. And then we also have protective services. So, for example, policing. Until the 1990s, policing in the UK was a local authority provided service, apart from London, where the Metropolitan Police reported directly to the Home Secretary before it became the responsibility of the new Greater London Authority. And chief constables were accountable to the police committees of county councils, in similar ways to other council committees, but their membership was 2/3 councillors and 1/3 magistrate. But the point is that this all changed in the Police and Magistrates Courts Act 1994, which increased the independence of the police committees, changed the composition and role of police authorities by making them independent, enhanced their powers over their own service provision, and made them more independent of their respective councils. And they were financed by a precept which councils have to include in their council tax bill, but the priorities are driven much more by the Home Office than councils. And then police and crime commissioners aim to hold more effectively to account police forces, but the public are broadly indifferent, and by establishing a separate individual to oversee the police, local councils have been undercut. Many people would argue it'd just be simpler, cheaper to give control of the police force, or at least oversight of the police force, back to county councils or the relevant councils where possible. There is also amenity services, so they're kind of for community needs: highways, transport, planning, development, environment, public health, things like that. So in the case of planning and development, the Localism Act 2011 applied to England only, but introduced legal provision under which communities, led by parish councils or neighbourhood forums, could develop neighbourhood plans, which have statutory weight, so would have to be considered in determining planning applications. And this is a role in terms of like shaping how communities look and feel. So in terms of public health, interestingly, they are one of the oldest local government services, and councils themselves grew out of the local boards of health and sanitary authorities set up under the Public Health Act of the 1870s. Local governments lost most of its curative health functions, i.e. making you better, due to the creation of the NHS in 1948, and then later in 1974, leaving it with only environmental health, although it still gives councils like greater health promotion and disease prevention potential than any other institution, including the NHS itself. Again, so you've got councils who are primarily responsible for the prevention of disease, and then the NHS, which was responsible for the curing of disease. Okay, and then we also get under the coalition primary care trusts and strategic health authorities were abolished, along with Labour government's performance targeting and commissioning of care services, which would devolve to new organisations, consortia of GP practices and an NHS commissioning board. We may see these changes changed, for want of a better phrase, under the Johnson government's plans. But what we see is that, again, healthcare services are not part of the local council, despite many people thinking that they might be. And then we have what's called facility services. So, for example, libraries, leisure, arts and recreation. And these are things that local government can provide if they want to, and often in competition with private sector provision. And these are the ones that have probably been cut the most due to things like austerity, right? If you've got no money, your library or your museum is probably the first thing to go. Okay? And all sizable projects now in culture, recreation, the arts, etc., are carried out in partnership with other agencies. So, Arts Council England, Sport England, or the relevant ones for other nations in the UK. And another example of just this local governance that has become increasingly popular in how our local lives and local policy is created. So historically, local authorities in the UK were only permitted to do things that they had specific statutory power to do. If an authority did something that it had no specific statutory power to do, this would be deemed ultra vires illegal. There have been calls to address this as far back as the 1960s. This is in contrast to local government in some Western European countries, where local government has free rein to do anything apart from what it is banned from doing so under law. This led to the Local Government Act 1972, Section 111, which gave local authorities the power to do anything which is calculated to facilitate or is conducive or incidental to the discharge of any of their functions. This was seen as a bit of a help, but it didn't really go that much further, because the things you were doing still had to be closely linked to what you could already do under law. New Labour introduced what was known as the Wellbeing Power in the Local Government Act 2000, which allowed local governments in England and Wales to promote the economic, social and environmental well-being of the area. A similar power was introduced in Section 20 of the Local Government Scotland Act 2003. Now, evidence suggests that it was only used occasionally by local authorities due to case law. Councils feared using such vague powers due to expensive lawsuits that they might not necessarily win. The Localism Act 2011 introduced the general power of competence for local authorities in England. And the general power of competence allows an organisation to do anything that individuals genuinely may do. Within England, the power extends to county councils, district councils, London borough councils, and eligible parish councils. That is, one in which at least 2/3 of the members have been elected and in which the clerk has completed one of a specific range of training courses. Now, under this general power of competence, you can do a lot more than you used to be able to, but you cannot do anything that is specifically prohibited in legislation. You can't raise taxes, you can't alter the political management structure of the authority, you can't engage in commercial activities that, as the council, they must be done through a private company. You must set up an arm's length company so there are no tax advantages. And authorities cannot trade in services that they have already got a statutory requirement to provide. So you can't start charging kids for school. And you can't use the general power of competence to make bylaws. You have to use pre-existing standard legal mechanisms for that. And if you don't have access to those mechanisms, you can't make bylaws. The power also applies to fire and rescue authorities when in pursuance of their statutory duties, integrated transport authorities, passenger transport executives, combined authorities if the authorities, member authorities consent to an order. English National Park authorities and the GLA, so the Greater London Authority, they only have a general power to promote economic development, social development, or the protection of the environment within London. Not all of this is through the 2011 legislation, but the Secretary of State can make orders to give other bodies this power as well. So it's flexible. However, it's important to not think of councils as like truly individual in this matter. So they would still have to, in the same way that you can go out and gamble all your money in one night and then regret it the next day, local authorities could not do that. They still have to meet public law constraints of rationality, i.e. are they acting in a rational manner? Relevant considerations, have they gone through the correct procedures? Procedural fairness, that they've not tried to gain an advantage in some nefarious way. Disregard of irrelevant considerations, even though an individual in the private sphere is not subject to them. Individuals can also defend decisions on, according to Tim Kirk, the power of intuition, a gut feeling, or I've always done it this way. An individual can behave capriciously or fecklessly, but local authorities cannot. They have to be able to withstand judicial review and thus follow due process. So whilst the range of activities that local authorities can engage in may have widened, the justifications they can use for following them has not. The power, the general power of competence, has been met with criticism. So Leach et al. Argue that the fact that the Secretary of State could make orders to prevent local authorities from doing anything specified in the orders undermines the whole point of a general power of competence. Effectively, if the Secretary of State can stop a council from doing anything, they don't have a real general power of competence. They have a conditional general power of competence. So for Leach et al., centralism is entrenched in the Act by the plethora of new powers, regulations and orders proposed for ministers to exercise. A better title would have been the Centralism Act. That's like a sick burn for local government scholars. So this is an example of devolving abilities to local government, but only when it suits central government. Local authorities and certain other bodies have powers under various Acts of Parliament to make bylaws, which are essentially local laws designed to deal with local issues. Powers over bylaw procedure are devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now in England, bylaws must be approved by the central government before they can be brought into force. The revocation also requires the intervention of central government. The rationale for this is that bylaws create criminal offences and should therefore be subject to scrutiny by central government. Bylaws must not duplicate or conflict with the general law, existing bylaws or any local act or common law. The nuisance that they address should merit criminal sanctions and, to a reasonable person, the penalty is available and proportionate, right? So no death penalty for putting your feet on the seats on Merseyrail, okay? They should directly address a genuine and specific local problem, and should not attempt to deal in general terms with national issues, right? So there's very limited scope, and they can't conflict with government policy. Very limited scope for what you can do with a bylaw, right? They're not really meant to be a wide-ranging power. The procedure for making bylaws is set out in Section 236 of the Local Government Act 1972. Bylaws can be made by county, district, unitary and parish councils on matters which come under their responsibility, but obviously not to overrule existing primary legislation. Now, I won't go through the exact procedures to create bylaws, but the central government, suffice to say, has a lot of power here. In all areas covered by government departments other than the Department for Communities, Local Government and Housing, the Secretary of State must confirm it and must also confirm revoking it. In Scotland, the Scottish Parliament is responsible for confirming bylaws in Scotland under the Local Government Scotland Act, which largely mirrors original provisions in England, apart from the fact local authorities can revoke bylaws without reference to the Scottish Parliament. Broadly similar provisions can be found in Northern Ireland of the Local Government Northern Ireland Act 1972. The Northern Assembly confirms bylaws in Northern Ireland. And in Wales, the responsibility for confirming bylaws fell to the Welsh Government until the passing of the Local Government Bylaws Wales Act 2012, which meant that confirmation of bylaws by the Welsh Government is not required. Local authorities can simply pass and revoke bylaws locally. So we've got a complete mismatch of what can and can't be done when it comes to combined authorities, to bylaws. Combined authorities are a legal structure that can be set up by local authorities in England. They can be set up with or without a directly elected mayor. Now, the key legislation here is the Local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Act 2009 and the City and Local Government Devolution Act 2016. Combined authorities can be set up by two or more local authorities. They can take on statutory functions transferred to them by an order made by the Secretary of State, plus any functions that constituent authorities agree to share. The 2009 Act provided that combined authorities could only undertake functions related to economic development, regeneration or transport, or functions that its member authorities agreed to transfer to it. But the 2016 Act removed these limits, permitting the Secretary of State to transfer other statutory functions or the functions of public bodies to combined authorities. Again, the Secretary of State has a lot of power, a lot of oversight here. So it's not a truly bottom-up process. Central government has to say yes as well. Section 10 of the 2016 Act permits the general power of competence for local authorities. And elected mayors can raise a precept on constituent authorities' local council tax bills, where the mayor is also the police and crime commissioner, and so also raises a precept in that capacity. The two funds have to be kept separate, so you can't use police and crime commissioner money to fund general combined authority upkeep or vice versa. Combined authorities with or without mayors may raise a levy on their members for any of their functions, and this constitutes a shift of funding between local authorities or between the local level rather than a means of raising new money locally. The idea being that if the 6 councils in the Liverpool City region, combined authority, decide to combine a function, then they might be able to benefit from economies of scale, and so that money could go further. But there's no new money being given. Combined authorities will also have the power to borrow money under the local government prudential borrowing scheme. Now, unlike local authorities, combined authorities represent a more consensual method of decision making. Generally, the mayor's political role is to take constituent authorities along with them, rather than creating new policy, right? So it's almost this ultimate governance role. Similarly, authorities have to convince the mayor of the plan. In many cases, majorities in favour of a decision must include the vote of the mayor, so the mayor has a veto role over decision making. But importantly, we should remember the difference between metro mayors and directly elected mayors, which were first introduced by the Local Government Act 2000. A directly elected mayor is one of the 3 different ways that you can organise your local council. However, local authority mayors do not have any more powers available to them than non-mayoral local authorities, right? On the other hand, metro mayors can be given powers to wield themselves by the Secretary of State or whatever local councils give to them. So the powers that each metro mayor has varies. And metro mayors, therefore, have different degrees of power. Finally, remember the London mayoral system is different as well. The London mayor is not an example of a metro mayor, and if you put this in your essay, you'd be penalised for it. So it suggests that the role of the metro mayors and also the London mayor is more of a reliance on soft power and informal governance skills rather than formal proceedings, votes, etc. to achieve desired outcomes. So this is another some great graphics from the Institute for Government as well, which outlines different powers that different authorities have over certain areas. Yeah, just to kind of really bring home the case that that no two are the same, but also the different level of funding and the 30-year investment fund that they receive. Okay, I really want you to understand that these are not a uniform type of or uniform powers given to these organisations. Okay? The idea is that they're meant to be responsible or reflected to local need. Finally, parish councils. So parish and town councils are the tier of local government that is closest to the electorate in the UK. Collectively, they're often referred to as local councils, in contrast to county, district and unitary authorities, which are often referred to as principal authorities. In your essays, it's best to be as clear as possible, right? Elected parish and town councils were first established by the Parish Councils Act 1894. This act removed all non-ecclesiastical functions from church and parish councils and passed them to newly established local elected bodies, which became known as the parish councils. The Local Government Act 1972 entirely restructured local government in England and Wales, where they were renamed community councils, and it provides the legal foundation for the existence of today's parish and town councils. Large parts of the 1972 Act have now been superseded with regard to principal authorities, but still broadly govern most of the workings of parish and town councils. Scotland has some 1,200 community councils, established under the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. Scottish community councils have no defined functions, but instead are to ascertain, coordinate and express the views of the community, and to take such action in the interest of that community as appears to it to be expedient and practical. In England, parish councils may raise a precept on the council tax bills of their unitary authority or district council. Council taxpayers can't refuse it. The billing authority cannot refuse to levy it. It is the only source of tax revenue available to parish councils, and they have no limit on how much they can increase it by, unlike principal authorities, which are limited to 5%, otherwise they have to have a referendum. Generally, the powers of English parish councils are equal to those of district councils, i.e. they're not subservient legal entities, right? District councils can't control parish councils don't have to answer to district councils, but district councils or unitary councils have certain reserved powers over the conduct of elections in parish councils, concerns over the legality of parish councils' actions, so they can be referred to a monitoring officer, but generally it's not possible to have a parish council's decision reversed at a higher level unless the decision can be shown to be unlawful. For most parish councils, the biggest barrier to action is capacity. Most lack the capacity to undertake the provisions of public services, so concern themselves with local environmental, community and amenity issues. This varies on the size of the parish, so some large town councils have substantial staff teams and may run a number of local facilities. Very small councils with a very small population might not have that. It might just be a group of volunteers and a clerk. Now, the only power that is available only to parish councils and not to other tiers of local government is the power to obtain and supply land for allotments if local demand cannot be met. They also have the general power of competence from the Localism Act 2011, but as I said earlier, they must be an eligible council. Two-thirds must be elected, not co-opted, and the clerk must have completed a relevant course. Localism Act also means that parish councils can develop a neighbourhood plan which must be in broad conformity with the local plan from other tiers of government, and it has to be subject to a local referendum, but it can then go on to influence planning decisions. The Localism Act also provides a community right to challenge, which gives local community groups the right to challenge local authorities' provision of services and to seek the opportunity to bid to run them themselves. The Act allows relevant bodies, voluntary or committee bodies, parish councils, or two or more employees of a relevant authority to challenge the provision of a service by a local authority. This policy has been criticised because it undermines the role of local government as the main democratic provider of key services. For Leach, this type of localism reflects a distrust in local government and a disdain for its lead role in the local governance network. Local communities typically involve a mix of special interest groups, neighbourhood-based organisations and influential individuals, raising issues about their accountability to local people. So one thing I want you to think about when it comes to parish councils is how they fit in with your conception of how democratic life should be followed within the UK, right? What role does it have to contribute to how we all, between the state and the individual? Do parish councils have a role, or are they basically just full of busybodies, right? We'll talk about the role of councillors, of mayors and of combined authorities and metro mayors in later lectures as well. This is just to get you familiar with the broad outline of basically what's going on.